Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Yissilmissil Productions channel. My name is Steven Yissil, and today we are continuing our deep dive series into the Bermuda Triangle. We are going to pick up from where we left off today on chapter 2. And we are on the Riddle of Missing Planes. This book is written by Gian J. Quasar. And we're getting into it. So I hope you enjoy. Just to let you know, the beginning of the intro where you hear radio and a person talking, that's actually a final transmission from someone who disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle. It was from the year 1980. I found it online. We'll go into it in more detail at a later time. But, I thought that was something worth noting. So, Chapter 2, The Riddle of Missing Planes. The current enigma of the Bermuda Triangle grew out of an extraordinary event that took place December 5th, 1945. This was the disappearance of not just one aircraft, but 5 aircraft. Hey Jay, good to see you out there. Hope you're digging the new setup. I spent a little bit of time on putting this all together. This was the disappearance of not just one aircraft, but 5 aircraft, and this took place December 5th, 1945. The 5 aircraft flying together in formation with a combined crew of 14. And then later that night, the disappearance of one of the rescue planes, carrying 13 crew. The disappearance of 6 aircraft and 27 military personnel without trace in one night was so extraordinary that public interest in this mystery eventually led to journalistic review of earlier and later disappearances until the Bermuda Triangle's name and reputation were established. And thank you, Mom. That's my mom in the chat, by the way. It's always good to have support of family in your projects, right? The flight was designated Flight 19, as it was the 19th flight in the roster to take off that day from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale in Florida. At this base, about 20 miles north of Miami, prospective naval pilots underwent advanced navigational training before being assigned to sea duty on carriers. Flight 19 was executing a basic training triangle. In their case, this triangular flight plan started at 2:10 p.m. at Fort Lauderdale and was scheduled to last about 2 hours and 15 minutes. It would take them no farther from base than 123 miles east over the Bahamas. Less than an hour's distance at their cruising speed of 140 miles per hour. In case an emergency required them to fly straight back to the coast. Part of the exercise involved making dummy bombs run at an old hulk near Bimini, about 56 miles east from base. Afterward, they would proceed farther easterly for 67 miles, following a heading of 091 degrees, then north-northwest on a heading of 346 degrees for 73 miles, then southwest back to base, finishing the triangle. And I believe there's a diagram in this book on the next couple of pages that describes this flight pattern. So once it pops up, I'll show it here on screen. Each of the three corners of the triangle was marked by a landfall or within sight of one. The weather was fair to average, with a gusting southwest trade wind pushing big billowy clouds. Each plane was topped off with fuel and oil, giving the squadron a range of over 1,000 miles. Navy Lieutenant Charles Taylor, the flight leader, was a veteran of combat in the South Pacific and had been flying since 1941. The other pilots were all seasoned servicemen who had switched to the Naval Air Force late in their military careers. All were graduate pilots with 350 or more flight hours under their belts. Marine Captain George Stivers Jr., pilot of FT-117, a 1942 graduate of the Naval Academy in Annapolis. I might be saying that wrong. I haven't spoken that area in a while. Was particularly honored, having been cited 3 times for gallantry in the South Pacific, twice at Guadalcanal, and once at Tarawa. Marine Captain Edward J. Powers Jr., a graduate of Princeton and a Marine since 1941, was an apt officer who had been assigned as a training instructor at Quantico, Virginia, throughout the war. Marine Second Lieutenant Jimmy Gerber had enlisted in the Marines after Pearl Harbor and worked his way up to officer and pilot. You see what they're describing here? They're giving all the credentials of all of these pilots that went missing in this flight. So far, all of them have backgrounds. People would miss them if they went missing. They were recognized in many forms. And although Ensign Joseph Bossi had been in for only 2 years, he passed up his discharge so he could continue to fly planes like the Avenger. In addition to the pilot, each Avenger carried 2 crew, a gunner and a radio man, who were undergoing advanced training with their pilot. Taylor, however, as the flight leader, had veterans on his plane, FT-28. These crew, like their pilots, were mostly seasoned Marines or naval ratings. When they took off that day, they were 1 man short. The radio man in Gerber's plane. FT-81 failed to show up, leaving him with only his gunner, Billy Lightfoot. Everything indicated the flight would be routine, if not dull. They carried out their scheduled bombing practice at Chicken and Hen Shoals, headed farther east, then headed northwest. Then something happened. Suddenly, and without warning. At 3:50 p.m., Taylor reported to Powers that his compasses were erratic. Then all the pilots compared their compass headings, but this merely led to another disagreement. 2 out of the 5 were sure they would head west, but there was no consensus. Meanwhile, another flight instructor, Lieutenant Robert Cox, flying in the vicinity of Fort Lauderdale, overheard the pilots discussing their headings and compasses. He contacted the flight moments later, and there ensued the following exchange. So this goes back and forth here. I will read it out verbatim, so just bear with me. This is between Cox and Taylor. So Cox says, "Planer boat calling Powers, what is your trouble?" Taylor says, "Both my compasses are out, and I am trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm overland, but it's broken. I'm sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down, and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." Cox says, "Put the sun on your port wing if you are in the Keys, and fly up the coast until you get to Miami. Then Fort Lauderdale is 20 miles further, your first port after Miami. The air station is directly on your left from the port. What is your present altitude? I will fly south and meet you." Taylor says, "I know where I'm at now. I'm at 2,300 feet. Don't come after me." Cox says, "Roger. I'm coming up to meet you anyhow." Cox immediately left his squadron and proceeded to the Keys, where Taylor supposed himself to be. However, his reception got worse, not better as it should have, indicating that Taylor was nowhere in the vicinity. The next messages overheard from Flight 19 were at 4:25 p.m. by the Port Everglades Rescue Facility. Taylor ordered Powers to lead the flight northeast, assuming he had a good compass. This was his attempt to bring them over Florida Bay to the southern Florida mainland. It was later asserted that the flight was over the Bahama Cays to the east of Florida, and that therefore this direction took them dangerously far into the Atlantic. A point of view later shared by both the Board of Inquiry and Lieutenant Cox. While this is offered as an explanation for why the flight didn't get back to land, it overlooks the fact that Flight 19 did not take this northeast heading for more than 25 minutes before turning west. A heading that, presuming the above estimate was accurate, would have brought them to Florida's east coast and safety within an hour. Military radio logs reveal that only 22 minutes after Flight 19 flew northeast, a certain amount of strain was already developing between the pilots when the coast of Florida did not come into view. Proof they were not over the Florida Bay. Taylor said, quote, "Let's turn and fly east 2 degrees. We're going too damn far north instead of east. If there's anything we wouldn't see it." End quote. Assuming he was in the Gulf of Mexico. Quote, "Damn it. If we would just head west, we would get home." End quote, said another pilot, presumably Powers. Hey Jason, good to see you in the chat. Only a minute or two later, at 5:11 p.m., a full-scale disagreement broke out between Taylor and Powers. Instead of flying east for 10 minutes according to Taylor's orders, Powers had apparently turned the flight on his own initiative. Taylor was heard to protest, quote, "You didn't get far enough east. How long have we been going east?" End quote. Minutes later, he or Powers, it's unsure, was picked up saying, quote, "We are now heading 270 west." End quote. Indicating Powers won the argument about direction. Then, at 5:15 p.m., Taylor was heard to confirm faithfully, quote, "We will head 270 until we hit the beach or run out of gas." End quote. Now that they had begun their westward course back to Florida, tensions at Fort Lauderdale were considerably eased, as they had always assumed Flight 19 was in the Atlantic, and now they were sure this would lead them back to the coast. But although the flight was presumably heading closer to shore, the radio reception never improved enough for the tower to definitively determine what the problems were. Thank you, Jay and Jason. I appreciate that. Jay says the audio and visual is really working for me. Also, a very nice contrast with the Let's Talk Matrix theme. Yep, thank you. I'm trying to make this distinctive for each series so that it has its own character to it. And Jason says, yeah, I like how each series has its own layout. So, that's what I'm going for here. I appreciate you guys noticing all that. As you can see below, we have the planes on the radar. We have the boats on the radar. We have the Illuminaut to the side of us. Alright, continuing on. Lieutenant Taylor was heard to order the flight to close formation. Quote, when first man gets down to 10 gallons of gas, we will all land in the water together. Does everyone understand that? End quote. Although this came over clear, attempts to help direct the flight were thwarted by frustrating blackouts. Taylor's answers to repeated calls to change radio channels were, quote, say again, end quote. Quote, I can hear you very faintly, end quote. Quote, my transmission is getting weaker, end quote. Quote, hello, hello, end quote. And, quote, repeat once again, end quote. After 30 minutes of this, at 5:54 p.m., finally refusing, quote, I cannot change frequency. I must keep my planes intact, end quote. At 6:05 p.m., when radio operators were naturally expecting the flight to be confirming that the shoreline lights were in view, a surprising dialogue sequence was clearly picked up, indicating no land was in sight and that Taylor, as a result, was becoming even more worried. Taylor was overheard to insist that they must be in the Gulf of Mexico and that flying west for the last 55 minutes had sent them dangerously into the heart of the Gulf, far from any land. He was overhead to suggest that powers turn the flight east yet again. There is no evidence, however, that powers turned the flight and headed east, for they all knew that for the last hour anyway there had been no land behind them. A high-frequency directional fix on their messages now added to the mystery. At the time of this dialogue, it placed them roughly 225 miles northeast of Fort Lauderdale, about 150 to 200 miles off the east coast of Florida, between New Smyrna Beach and Jacksonville. Instead of dispelling the mystery, this fix confirms that the flight had flown much farther into the Atlantic than was possible, and that all the while, almost an hour, they had thought they had been heading west or northwest. They had instead been heading north. They should have covered 140 miles in that time, but were still incredibly far out in the Atlantic. By this time, it was becoming increasingly obvious that this was not a typically lost flight. Several personnel at the bases became convinced that none of the equipment on Flight 19 was reliable anymore. This controversy, one of the most inexplicable surrounding Flight 19, has been sustained by an examination of several confusing statements that were overheard. One should remember that following a westward heading, even according to Powers' compasses, only took them north instead. Bits and pieces of other dialogue overheard throughout the unusual flight and in-flight drama were noteworthy for the tone of mild panic, even early on, when, assuming normal circumstances, there seems to have been little reason for panic. Indications of erratic equipment readings, including compasses, fuel gauges, airspeed indicators, and perhaps altimeters, might be suggested by the following recorded dialogue. Soon after announcing they were lost, Taylor expresses with a certain impatient frustration, quote, "We don't seem to be getting far," end quote, referring to speed and covering ground. Again, when explaining to Cox how he thinks they got lost, he said, quote, "We were out on a navigational hop, and on the second leg I thought they were going wrong, so I took over and was flying them back to the right position. But I'm sure now that neither one of my compasses are working," end quote. Yet given these circumstances, it seems remarkable and unexplainable that none of the other pilots bothered to point out to him they were on course to begin with. Instead, they seemed to be surprised, and a couple of them unsure, as Taylor, when he asks for a comparison of compasses. Neither were IFF signals received from the planes, though the flight confirmed they were on, nor did their ZBX gear, which is a homing device, detect Fort Lauderdale's beacon. At 5:55 p.m., one pilot suddenly interjects, quote, "We may have to ditch any minute," end quote. Though the gauges indicating the fuel crisis must soon have corrected themselves again. So they were dealing with a lot of different malfunctions in their equipment during this time on Flight 19. During the last hour of contact with the flight, the messages were the most broken and strained. Quote, "Powers, come in, Powers," end quote, Lieutenant Taylor called. Quote, "Hello, Powers. I've been trying to reach you," end quote. Quote, what course are we on now?" End quote. This Taylor was overheard to ask a number of times until 6:37 p.m., when this line was the last message overheard from him. So he went almost 42 minutes asking, "What course are we on now?" And that was the last thing recorded that he was asking. The faint dialogue finally faded out altogether at 7:04 p.m., when Ensign Bossy's call sign, quote, Fox Tear 3, Fox Tear 3, Fox Tear 3, end quote, came in surprisingly clear and then abruptly ended. We're going to have to listen to that audio recording as well from 1980, which is at the beginning of the show's intro. It made me feel a certain way listening to that. With that one, it just cuts out and you hear a bunch of static. And that event from 1980, the pilot was describing that they were trying to get over Puerto Rico, but that there was something ahead of them in their flight path that was keeping them from continuing on their path. And they said it's something weird. This is what you hear at the beginning of this intro here. So I kind of cut it together so that you hear that, but then it also cuts out. It's just static. And that's the rest of the transmission. And those people were never found, by the way. But getting back to Flight 19. Out of all the confusing elements of that night, the question of who was in command is yet another mystery. From earlier dialogue, it had appeared obvious to many listening in that Captain Powers had taken complete command of the flight and was determined to go west no matter what. Although a student, Powers was the senior officer, having 5 months seniority on Taylor, and could have pulled rank. In any case, by 6 o'clock, Taylor was not giving orders, but only, quote, suggesting, end quote, course changes to Powers. Something that piqued the interest of the Board of Inquiry. It is nonetheless irrelevant who was in command. Flight 19, with their fuel and a westward direction, should have made land. The mystery of where their compasses were directing them is compounded by the mystery of radio reception. The signals were strangely erratic. Clear one moment, they faded to barely audible the next moment, died out altogether, or were obscured by heavy static. Pensacola had a far greater range, a high-frequency directional finding station, than Fort Lauderdale. But though they were about the same distance from Flight 19 at this time, their reception was a little better, with the same frustrating blackouts. Every time a direct message to help the flight was attempted, there was interference. But interplane chatter was sometimes surprisingly clear. This mystery had begun early in the flight. Clear or prolonged radio reception had never been possible, even when, as in the beginning, they had been closer to shore. This, the mystery of the radio reception, has a counterpart in the mystery of their ETA. The Navy was certain it was 5:23 p.m. This was, however, an hour past the correct landing time of 4:23 p.m. As a result, The Navy did not undertake aggressive rescue operations until over an hour after the flight had been due. So they waited 2 hours? Man. And furthermore, about 2 hours after it had become lost. See, I'm giving my my opinion and my comment here as I'm reading, and then sometimes it's actually answering its own thing in the next sentence here. Alright, so we have the diagram here now, the flight path. So I'll just show it to you now before I read the caption. Sorry that it's a little dark here. So here we have in part 1 of the diagram, it says the triangle represents probable navigation 1. So that was the probable navigation, so that's a guesswork there. Right by the Great Bahama. Number 2, Taylor last reported, quote, "We just passed over a small island. We have no other land in sight," end quote, just before they headed 30 degrees northeast. Most assume it was Walker Cay, Bahamas. Following his course orders, by 6 p.m., the flight should have been approaching Banana River. So that's what number 2 is on there, the half triangle. And then number 3 is instead a directional fix found them within a 100-mile radius of this area up here. So this was the probable flight path. Wow, okay. So again, this is the probable flight path down here. This is what was tracked. And then once the tracking disappeared, they ended up somewhere up here before finally disappearing altogether. Yeah, so that's... I'm correct in saying that. This is a probable flight path. This is the last known reported flight path. And then that's the last place they guess where it ended up. Yeah, Jay, it is crazy. Like, they have all of this equipment and it's going all haywire. No explanation. And look, I guess we should also take a look at the islands that are here too. So we got Fort Lauderdale, we got Miami, we got Bimini down on the bottom, Great Bahama, Walker Cay, Great Abaco. We've got the rest of those there. And then what's this? Florida Keys, yeah, of course. So considering this, you have all of this that has land that's underwater along the Florida Keys. All of this, I think, was much larger in the past. Like, this coastline probably swung all the way out here and around. And for all we know, it could have just... all of this could have been land. at one point. These just ended up being the highest parts of the area prior to the flooding. Because we know now this thing found roads on the bottom of the ocean around the area. So again, we have to ask, is it ancient telecommunications that are interfering with our present day technology? Like, I'm still questioning what's happening here. Alright, we're going to keep going. Then there is the mystery of their fuel endurance. Their fuel was originally estimated to be exhausted by 6:30 p.m., then 7 p.m., then lastly by 8 p.m. that night. But these estimates did not take into account the possibility that the pilots would adjust their control settings and throttle back. This way they would stagger their fuel and prolong their already impressive fuel range, though they would be cruising at a reduced speed. This may account for the appearance that they had been making little progress back to the coast, but not explain, of course, how they got so far north in the first place. They could possibly, at some TBM Avenger pilots emphasized, have extended their total flight time to 7 or 8 hours. This would have given them a flight time of possibly 2 hours after the flight's last brief message was received at 7:04 p.m. Yeah, Jay, that actually gives me chills, what you mentioned here. Jay says it gets sketchy before the final burst. It makes a certain kind of sense to have some instability before some final shift. Again, the determined flight path right here, the last known flight path, which I'm assuming this was heading east and then went southwest, and then that line is not finished because there's no more signal, and then they ended up somewhere up here. And meanwhile, it seems like since this was a group of planes, some of those planes had clear communication with each other, but the bases did not have clear communication. And it was going erratic. So definitely a shift occurred here. Alright, continuing on. Then there's the mystery of the delayed call letters. Quote, FT, FT, end quote. Heard by search pilots hours after the flight was estimated to have exhausted their fuel. They were dismissed as wishful thinking, though in retrospect, assuming they throttled back, the letters very likely were from the flight. But this adds yet another element of mystery. Where were they during these hours? Perhaps up at that number 3 location in that circle radius? That's what I'm guessing. So let's just assume here that they did throttle their planes so that they would be flying slower and saving gas. it doesn't explain that their call letters were heard hours after they were suspected to have ran out of fuel. It doesn't make any sense in that regard. Jay says, maybe the events at Bermuda Triangle are related to specific characteristics of the people involved. Yeah, it's very possible, Jay. You know, in some of these instances with dealing with the Wu subjects, it seems like either these people are chosen because of their certain makeup and abilities, unseen abilities. You know, that I would even say people's chi energy. If you're really in tune with nature and grounded in your soul, knowing where you're at in life and everything, I think that contributes to whether you have reception to this area. But it also does seem like it's a Shark Tank of sorts, where whoever goes into this area also deals with trouble and problems. But that's a very good possibility, Jay. It might be that, but this is multiple planes in a pattern flying. Just doing routine flying. And then this occurs. It's not like it was any special event or anything, but maybe it is those special pilots and their otherworldly abilities that drew them into this phenomenon here. Then there is the mystery of the search by a big PBM mariner with 13 crewmen. Alright, so I guess we're going to be moving on from Flight 19 now. But I am sure we'll get back to it at some point. So, alright, one more time before we move on here. Here's the projected flight plan for Flight 19, just off the coast of Fort Lauderdale. I'm sorry, it's not lit up too well. What's going on here? Alright. So you got the Fort Lauderdale launch off and where they were expected to go. This is what was actually logged. So it's like they were off course already, and then here is where they supposedly ended up after going off the radar over here. Man. Yeah, we'll definitely get back to Flight 19. But, this is the next case in the chapter here. Then there is the mystery of the search by a big PBM mariner with 13 crewmen. It was airborne only 20 minutes, heading directly out to Flight 19's last known position. So here we go. We've got a search and rescue mission here. Also with anomalies. It was airborne only 20 minutes, heading directly out to Flight 19's last known position, when it, too, was swallowed up into the void. Off the coast of Florida at 7:50 p.m., the sky tore across a color of amber and red as a fireball 100 feet high pulsed with explosion. The freighter Gaines Mill reported it was directly overhead. Meanwhile, the USS Solomon's radar scope lost the PBM blip in the precise area. So do you understand that? There was an explosion of some sort by the rescue plane in this area. And a boat was underneath them, witnessing all of this. No, the PBM Mariner was a boat. Right? So the USS Solomon lost the PBM blip on their radar scope in that precise area. Regardless of being in the immediate vicinity, the Gaines Mill could locate nothing but an oil slick. Nor did any of the other search aircraft being redirected to this area locate anything. So they sent out a search and rescue ship, the PBM Mariner, 13 crewmen, well, it says it was airborne only 20 minutes, so it's not a ship. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to clarify here. I'm so caught up in this. So the PBM Mariner was in flight. It's not a ship. Carrying 13 crewmen. It was airborne only 20 minutes, heading directly out to Flight 19's last known position when it too was swallowed up into the void. And then there was a report of a fireball 100 feet high that pulsed with explosion. And the freighter ship, Gaines Mill, reported it was directly overhead. See, so that makes it clear. This is why I reread some of these things on here. Because it can get confusing. And I want to be as accurate as possible here while we move along. So meanwhile, the USS Solomon's radar scope lost the PBM blip in the precise area. Regardless of being in the immediate vicinity, the Gaines Mill could locate nothing but an oil slick, nor did any of the other search aircraft being redirected to this area locate anything. Besides the mystery of the PBM, the actual search for Flight 19 presents many peculiar mysteries of its own, including unexplained lights, described variously as streaking or dancing, or as flares. Was someone or something trying to get their attention and distract them and bring them off course? Was it a cry for help from another aircraft or group of aircraft? See, this doesn't even necessarily have to be from the same time either. This could be a number of things here, but the whole concept of time slips, I wouldn't be surprised if this was another flight path from the past or the future, and they were lost as well, and they were trying to get any communication out. But on the nefarious side of things, this sounds like UFO activity to me. They were seen as far as from the Keys to the Atlantic off Jacksonville, labeled inconsistently as red, green, or white, but their sources remained unidentified, a phenomenon seen to this day after other disappearances. So we got 3 different colors here, too. Dancing lights. Unexplained lights, streaking, or dancing, or as flares. Daylight search operations started at 6 a.m. the next morning. This included all aircraft from the entire east coast of Florida and numerous warships and civilian merchant ships that had been rerouted during the night and were still continuing to search. This search, maintaining an average of 200 planes each day and dozens of search vessels, was finally discontinued on December 10th when appended advice to, quote, keep a sharp lookout and report anything pertinent, end quote. A command which 3 decades later one author, Richard Weiner of the Devil's Triangle, emphasized was never rescinded. So I'm just making a note here. Probably not use my bookmark. That'd be a good idea. See, I write down the names of these authors and books as we come across them. And this gets added to the deep dive here for further research. Okay. So again, Richard Weiner of the Devil's Triangle. So to this day, no trace of the 5 Avengers from Flight 19 has yet been found, despite undersea cameras, sonar, and extensive bottom mapping of the sea in the area of the Gulf and the Atlantic as far as North Carolina. Every place Flight 19 could have reached. Weeks after the incident, members of the Naval Board of Inquiry that had been convened to unravel the case were not able, in the words... Oh, I'm sorry. Perhaps we're getting to the good stuff here. It usually happens when my voice starts going. Weeks after the incident, members of the Naval Board of Inquiry that had been convened to unravel the case were not able, in the words of the information officer, Captain W.C. Wingard, quote, to make even a good guess as to what happened, end quote. So even these ranked officials couldn't explain it. But again, we have to keep in mind that these officials, we read before in previous parts here that they would rather go with conventional explanations and not supernatural. Captain William O. Birch, the Fort Lauderdale NAS commanding officer, gave the following formal statement. Quote, what happened is unbelievable. Only 15 minutes before the squadron of the Avengers left our base at 2:10 p.m. that Wednesday, another flight of 5 similar planes took off, flew exactly the same course, and returned safely without incident. It encountered no unusual weather conditions except the wind picked up 10 or 15 knots, end quote. After the adjournment, these subheads in the Kansas City Star newspaper were typical of many. Quote, Navy still makes no explanation of mysterious disappearance of 5 planes on a routine flight over Florida, nor why the 6th, a rescue plane, also never returned. End quote. Some of the search pilots, still considering this incident today, are of the opinion that they had not been searching far enough north. They are quick to mention that the orders were to search as far north as Jacksonville, Florida. However, if the flight ditched north of here, the Gulf Stream's northward current would sweep debris beyond the search perimeters. Hey Texas, good to see you on here. We're reading about Flight 19 and its mysterious disappearance, and we're getting into all the accounts surrounding all of that. The search plane ended up going missing. You had 5 aircraft go missing, and then the 6th, which was the search plane, also went missing. You had a ship that witnessed some sort of an explosion that went 100 feet into the air. And there were mysterious lights that were red, green, and white in color, and also appeared to be looking like flares in the sky. And so far through this chapter, it's explaining that they never found the plane. Joe O'Brien, a member of Flight 22 that day, had considered the incident over the last 58 years. Along with Bob Cox, he was one of the few pilots who had any even fleeting radio contact with Taylor after he was initially announced he was lost. He is of the opinion, as are others, that the flight may have flown over the peninsula of Florida by that evening, and ironically ended up in the Gulf, where Taylor first thought he was. While the last stations overheard Flight 19 clearly both bordered the Gulf of Mexico, namely Pensacola, Florida, and Houma, Louisiana. And in parentheses it says high-frequency direction-finding stations. End parentheses. Neither recorded anything after about 6:45 p.m. It is unlikely then that Flight 19 headed toward the Gulf, since a continuation of this course would naturally have brought them closer to Pensacola and Houma, and their radio signals would have become clearer, not fade away as they did. Yeah, and usually radio interference like that, if it's fading away, that means it's getting out of range. So what does that mean? Captain Don Poole, then a lieutenant commander, and the flight officer at NAS Fort Lauderdale, who took over the operations from the tower and tried to guide the flight back, perhaps still has the only fair summation of the many inconsistencies and mysteries of that night. Quote, I'll be the first to admit that we don't know where in the hell those planes finally ended up. End quote. Think about that one for a second. David White, Then a lieutenant and one of the search pilots recalls having their evening poker game disturbed by the duty officer when he burst in and told them to muster at 5 a.m. Quote, "We take off at 6 a.m. We have an entire squadron missing." End quote. Yeah, no crap. He recalled his reaction, quote, "I thought, how could we have lost 5 planes?" End quote. 5 planes. All together. A similar reaction came from Joe O'Brien, who recalled that at one point in a conversation with a buddy that night, he said, quote, "What are people going to say 20 years from now if we lose an entire flight?" End quote. Well, that was in 1945. Well, 1965, they were, I guess, still questioning it. And then in 74, Charles Berlitz wrote his Bermuda Triangle book. And then now it's 2004 in this book, and there's still no answers. 59 years later, still no answer. Up to this point. And I believe there's still no answer today. I mean, I'm assuming that right now. In the decades since 1945, these sentiments, along with their ninefold of consternation, have been embraced by a greater and greater number of people. There seems to be no logical explanation for the disappearance of 5 aircraft or for the many confusing reports that night. Attempts to blame Taylor to overlook the fact that Powers could not bring the flight back, even with enough fuel and following a, quote, westward, end quote, heading. Blaming any pilot cannot explain the lack of debris or bodies at sea. When pondering all of these, it is not surprising that the enigma of the Bermuda Triangle developed and in turn maintained a tight grip over the incident. An entire flight of 5 planes plus 1 rescue plane, carrying a combined total of 27 men, completely vanished. If this had been an isolated incident, it would remain a great mystery of aviation. However, continuing disappearances of aircraft afterward, many in the same area, and some with drawn-out and confusing radio messages like Flight 19's, indicate that perhaps it is only one of many, all sharing a similar cause or at least some crucial factor before meeting the same fate. So now we're jumping ahead about 2 years later from Flight 19. On July 3rd, 1947, a big 4-engine C-54, the military equivalent of a DC-4 airliner, vanished. The military cargo flight left Bermuda early that morning for Morrison Air Force Base in southern Florida. A search eventually found a large oxygen bottle and cabin paneling, indicating the aircraft must have been obliterated. A later study of the radio communications and reported headings curiously revealed that never once had it been on its correct course, nor apparently were its many navigational errors apparent to the pilot, Major Ralph Ward, a veteran of considerable reputation. See, when they say about these people having considerable reputation, what they're saying is that these weren't just some random people saying, oh, it must have went missing. No, these were ranked officials. They had tenure. Their word meant something in the social spheres. So, not only do these accounts like hold weight of the people that were back on land hearing these erratic radio waves and signals, but also the pilots that disappeared also held significant rank and reputation within their social circles. I'm going to take a brief pause here. So, just chill with me here for a second. Okay. The disappearance of the Tudor 4 airliner Star Tiger just 7 months later, in the pre-dawn of January 31st, 1948, is one of the most startling events in the Triangle. The airliner, with 29 passengers and crew, had left hours earlier from Santa Maria, Azores. Santa Maria, Azores. One of its many fuel stopovers from London to Havana, Cuba. While approaching Bermuda, the pilot, Captain B.W. McMillan, made the expected contact with Kindley Field, his next stopover, requesting a radio bearing to calibrate his navigation and make sure he was still on course. The response indicated the plane was slightly off course. Its position was corrected after Bermuda relayed a first-class bearing of 72 degrees from the island. At this point, Star Tiger was less than 2 hours away from Bermuda, and it confirmed its estimated time of arrival at 5 a.m., an hour late due to the headwinds. This was the last transmission ever heard from the aircraft. Rescue operations were aided by the fact that the plane's last known position report was precise, placing its disappearance within a confined track line northeast of Bermuda. In spite of this, no trace was ever found, and the search operation was discontinued, with negative results. The report issued by the Civil Air Ministry contains an impressive official recital of what could not have happened to the plane. Quote, "There would accordingly appear to be no grounds for the supposing that Star Tiger fell into the sea in consequence of having been deprived of her radio, having failed to find her destination, and having exhausted her fuel." I'll read that one more time to let it sink in here. There would accordingly appear to be no grounds for supposing that Star Tiger fell into the sea in consequence of having been deprived of her radio, having failed to find her destination, and having exhausted her fuel. End quote. So they're ruling all of that out right at the get-go. Alright, Jay. Jay says he has to go. You have a good one. thank you for being here. I'll be going a little longer. I might actually try to finish this chapter, even though it's 40 pages. We'll see how far I get into it. But, I'll definitely see you later, Jay. Thank you for being here. Whatever occurred, it was concluded that it did so extremely rapidly. Quote, there is good reason to suppose that no distress message was ever transmitted from the aircraft, for there were many radio receiving stations listening on the aircraft's frequencies, and none reported such a message. End quote. I want to point out real quick in the chat here, Jay used one of the member emojis of the graded road with a truck, one of those yellow caution signs. That is for one of our future deep dive series on Gravity Hills, which that's going to be fascinating to cover as well. And the only way you could see it first when released will be by being a member. So I think what I'll do with that is eventually I will make it available to the public, but that'll be one of the first deep dives that will not be broadcast live for everybody. It'll be a members only video. But all of this is free for all of you on this channel. It's all free. This series, along with the few others that are currently running. But let's continue reading here. Whether information proved, quote, the weather was stable, there was no atmospheric disturbances of a serious kind which might cause structural damage to the aircraft, and there were no electrical storms. End quote. The aircraft could not have gone off course. After the broadcast bearing from Bermuda, with the winds prevailing, Star Tiger would have been brought to within 30 miles of Bermuda. Quote, the aircraft could hardly have failed to find the island in a short time. In the conditions of visibility which prevailed. End quote. Engine trouble as a possible cause was ruled out, since at this late stage in her flight, without the added weight of her fuel, she could have flown safely on 3 or even 2 engines instead of the 4 she had. The possibility she could lose 3 engines was considered absurd. Faced with all the evidence, the Board of Investigation soberly addressed the loss of Star Tiger in some of the most eloquent language ever entered into any accident report. And I'm going to read this report right now. It's about a paragraph. In closing this report, it may truly be said that no more baffling problem has ever been presented for investigation. In the complete absence of any reliable evidence as to either the nature or the cause of the accident to Star Tiger, the court has not been able to do more than suggest possibilities, none of which reaches the level even of probability. Into all activities which involve the cooperation of man and machine, 2 elements enter of a very diverse character. There is the incalculable element of the human equation, dependent upon imperfectly known factors. And there is the mechanical element, subject to quite different laws. A breakdown may occur in either separately or both in conjunction. Or some external cause may overwhelm both man and machine. What happened in this case will never be known, and the fate of Star Tiger must remain an unsolved mystery. That's the end of the report. The mystery of the Star Tiger was compounded in a stunning way just 1 year later. On January 17th, 1949... hold on a second. So, the Star Tiger incident was January 31st, 48. And then on January 17th, 1949, her sister airliner, Star Ariel, inexplicably vanished south of Bermuda. She had just taken off from Bermuda on a fine early morning, carrying 19 crew and passengers bound for Kingston, Jamaica. About an hour later, her captain, Gian C. McPhee, sent this radiogram to Bermuda, Kingston, and New York's Oceanic Air Control. Quote, I departed from Kindley Field at 8:41 a.m. hours. My ETA at Kingston, 1:10 p.m. hours. I am flying in good visibility at 18,000 feet. I flew over 150 miles south of Kindley Field at 9:32 hours. My ETA at 30 degrees north is 9:37 hours. Will you accept control? End quote. Shortly afterward, at 9:42 a.m., he sent a last brief message. Quote, I was over 30 degrees north at 9:37. I am changing frequency to MRX. End quote. Both Nassau and Kingston's radio frequencies. However, although he indicated he was just switching frequencies, neither aerodrome ever received any word from him. After 1:10 p.m., so this is hours later, the scheduled ETA Star Ariel was listed as overdue, and the search began within 2 hours. The search was aided by military vessels in the area, Coast Guard cutters and life stations, and other aircraft flying that same route. It was finally discontinued with the same results as in Star Tiger's case. Negative. The investigation of this disappearance was perhaps even more intense than that to which Star Tiger had been subjected, yet with equal lack of logical explanation. Quote, there were no weather complications at all. A study of the weather reports gives no indication of any abnormal conditions. There were no clouds above 10,000 feet over the whole route. The freezing level was 14,000 feet, so there was no question of icing. Unexplained radio interference was reported during the plane's flight time, beginning close to its time of departure and ending eerily around its estimated time of arrival. This ranged from, quote, blackouts, end quote, to hazy reception that came and went without reason. Something's interfering with these radio signals. Affecting certain stations while not affecting others, and then vice versa. I'm just imagining an interference wave going up and down. No particular direction, but when it's interfering different channels at different times, that means it's switching channels, and it's pretty much navigating through it like that. Whatever this interference was, I'm saying that's what it was doing with that. And yet, we don't know what was causing the interference. An examination of this interference, however, yielded no clue to why a distress signal was not picked up, since a Mayday is an all-points bulletin, and some station would have heard one. The report under John Moore Brabazon, Lord of Tara, and head of the investigation committee, concluded it was lost suddenly. Quote, the captain's procedure was correct. That he did not reestablish communication with Bermuda after failure to contact Kingston or any other Caribbean station must be assumed to have been because of inability to do so. End quote. One must inject, quote, lightning-like, end quote, since this, quote, inability, end quote, struck between switching frequencies. While sabotage was suspected, but without evidence, because both aircraft belonged to the same corporation, an equally astounding disappearance had happened only a few weeks earlier of an aircraft of an entirely different carrier on a completely different route. In parentheses, it says, though still within the triangle. End parentheses. A disappearance that is even more impossible to explain. Let's reread that one more time. While sabotage was suspected but without evidence, because both aircraft belonged to the same corporation, an equally astounding disappearance happened only a few weeks earlier of an aircraft of an entirely different carrier on a completely different route, though still within the triangle, a disappearance that is even more impossible to explain. This was a big DC-3 airliner, a twin-engine aircraft considered to be the most reliable type of airplane ever built. It took off from San Juan, Puerto Rico at 10:03 p.m. on December 27th, 1948, with a full complement of passengers and crew, totaling 31 people. 31 people. So it's like more and more people go missing with each of these instances here. NC16002, its official registration number, circled the field until its transmitter was completely charged. In parentheses, it says the battery was discovered to be low on water when it had landed. End parentheses. After successful contact with San Juan, it headed northwest to its destination of Miami. At about 3:40 a.m., shortly before its ETA of 4:03 a.m. at Miami, Robert Lindquist, the DC-3's pilot, was overheard reporting himself just 50 miles south of Miami, in terms of time just beginning his approach. The flight was on schedule. The weather was perfect without any complications whatsoever. Nevertheless, the large airliner, with all its passengers and crew, was never seen again. No explosions were reported. The usual case of sudden loss. A thorough search even included the Everglades because the flight's approach to Miami was over shallow, transparent water. The inexplicable or inexplicable lack of trace of the aircraft in these conditions suggest it might have suffered an unknown navigational breakdown and may have been far off course. Although this might sound logical, it also presupposes that the radio ceased to function in the interim as well and that Lindquist did not recheck his position by astral navigation. A combination of the above, it should be remembered, was declared, quote, beyond probability, unquote, in the case of Star Tiger. Again, the lack of debris cannot be blamed on any mechanical or human failure. A number of unexplained radio quirks during NC-16002's flight time cannot be blamed on its radio. When the plane was only an hour from San Juan, Lindquist reported his altitude at 8,300 feet. Yet, he was not heard by San Juan, but was overheard by Miami, 700 miles away. When 50 miles south of Miami, it was actually New Orleans, 600 miles northwest, that picked up the message and relayed it to Miami. So, are all of you understanding this? I'll reread this. When the plane was only an hour from San Juan, Lindquist reported his altitude at 8,300 feet. Yet he was not heard by San Juan, but overheard by Miami, 700 miles away. Then, when 50 miles south of Miami, it was actually New Orleans, 600 miles northwest, that picked up the message and relayed it to Miami. This disturbing coincidence of unusual, quote, voids, unquote, in the atmosphere, interfering with the lost plane's radio communication, will be noteworthy in other disappearances. I am going to end today's show here, since that is the last of that particular case. There's many more cases in this chapter. We still have another 25 pages to read, so I will save that for next week. We'll continue chapter 2, the Riddle of Missing Planes. But that should be enough for all you to chew on for this week. I want to be able to keep this quality up here, because my verbal reading ability apparently seems to break down over time as I keep going here. And I want to be as articulate as possible. So, that'll do it for today. I really hope you enjoyed this part of the series, as we're getting into all the plane disappearances. But again, this is from the book Into the Bermuda Triangle, and we will be continuing on next week. We're still barely in, but this is jam-packed with information. Very well thought out, research put together well by Gian J. Quasar. And we'll get through it. We'll get through this entire book here as we find more and more details on these disappearances and what they could all possibly mean. I'll leave you with that. So thank you everyone for being here. And until the next one, class dismissed.